He accidentally kidnapped an Apache girl, but what he did next changed his life forever. The girl wasn't supposed to be there. Not on his land, not bleeding into his soil, and definitely not wearing that particular necklace. It was the same silver piece he'd seen in his nightmares for 3 long years. A ghost made of metal and stone. Cassidy Flynn had lived alone on this ridge for a good reason. He wanted to be forgotten. But when he found her crumpled by the creek, unconscious and pale, something about her face made his hands shake in a way that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. She was a trespasser on the quiet misery he'd built for himself. He should have walked away. Every instinct, honed by 3 years of bitter isolation, screamed at him to turn his back. Trouble was like a stray dog. Feed it once, and it never leaves. But he couldn't. He saw the silver and turquoise glinting at her throat, a pattern that made his stomach twist into a knot of ice. He'd seen that exact necklace before, in a place he'd sworn never to think about again. So he scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, a broken bird in his arms. Her skin was fever hot against his, and a nasty gash across her forehead was weeping blood. As he carried her toward his cabin, a grim little box he called home, he noticed the quality of her dress. It wasn't the rough spun cotton of a settler's daughter. The weaving was intricate, beautiful, the work of Apache hands. She was no one from around here, which meant someone was looking for her, and people who went looking for other people in this territory rarely had good intentions. Inside his sparse home, he laid her gently on his cot and began cleaning her wounds with the cold efficiency of a man who'd seen too much of this. The head wound was ugly, but it wouldn't kill her. More concerning were the rope burns on her wrists, still fresh and angry red. Someone had tied her up, and they'd done it recently. As he worked, her dark eyes fluttered open. She didn't scream. She didn't scramble away. Most people were afraid of Cassidy these days, of the ghost they saw living in his eyes. But she just watched him, her gaze so intense it felt like she was peeling back the layers of his soul, reading a story he'd long since tried to burn. She was looking for something, and the terrifying part was, he thought she might have found it. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry whisper, and the words that came out weren't Apache, and they weren't English. She spoke in perfect Spanish. ¿Por qué me ayudas? The question hit him like a physical blow. Not just the language, but the way she asked it. Not with fear, not with gratitude, but with the exhausted resignation of someone who'd been betrayed so many times that kindness was now the most suspicious thing in the world. Because you needed help, he answered, first in English, then stumbling through the Spanish words. She closed her eyes, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he'd lost her. Then she spoke again, her voice a thread of sound. They will come looking for me. Who will? He asked. Before she could answer, the rhythmic beat of approaching horses cut through the morning stillness. It wasn't a casual sound. It was the sound of men who rode with a purpose. Cassidy moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. 3 riders were coming up his dirt path, moving with the calculated precision of wolves. They wore the buckskins of trappers, but their eyes scanned his property like soldiers evaluating a battlefield. Their hands never strayed far from the pistols at their hips. Behind him, the girl had gone silent. When he glanced back, her eyes were wide with a terror so pure it made the air in the cabin feel thin and cold. Too late, she whispered. The lead rider dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle and in violence. His boots hit the packed earth without a sound. Cassidy recognized the type immediately, the kind of man who could kill you and not even break a sweat. His 2 companions stayed mounted, their gazes sweeping the tree line, their hands resting on their weapons. They weren't just watching him, they were establishing a field of fire. Morning, the man called out, his voice slick with the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. Name's Gideon Nash. We're looking for something that belongs to us. Cassidy stepped out onto his porch, his old rifle held loosely in his hands, visible but not threatening. Not yet. Don't see how I can help you, he said, his voice a low gravel. Nothing here but me and my land. Nash's smile never wavered, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those cold, dead eyes were already cataloging every detail of Cassidy's property. The rain barrel, the woodpile, the slightly ajar window of the cabin. "See, that's funny," Nash said, taking a slow step forward. "Because we've been tracking our property for 2 days now, and the trail leads right to your door." "Property," Cassidy repeated, the single word flat and cold. His grip tightened on the rifle stock. "Young Apache girl," Nash said, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "Goes by the name Ayana. Real valuable to certain parties, if you catch my meaning." He took another step, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. "She's been causing some folks a considerable amount of trouble." From inside the cabin, Cassidy heard a faint creak of floorboards. The girl, Ayana, was moving, trying to hide, or maybe trying to find a way out. The raw, red rope burns on her wrists suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. These men weren't trappers, they were hunters, manhunters. "Haven't seen any Apache girls," Cassidy lied, the words coming easier than they should have. "You boys might want to try the next valley over." Nash let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's disappointing to hear, because see, we know she's hurt, and hurt animals. Well, they tend to seek shelter. A man living all alone out here might take pity on a stray that wandered onto his land." One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, and Cassidy caught the glint of sunlight on metal. It wasn't just a pistol. The man had a rifle in a scabbard and another holstered across his chest. More firepower than any honest trapper would ever need. "Like I said," Cassidy repeated, his voice dangerously low, "haven't seen anyone." His old military training was kicking in now, a ghost whispering in his ear. He was cataloging distances, cover points, escape routes. 3 against 1. Bad odds, but not impossible. "Tell you what," Nash said, his tone turning oily and conversational. "Why don't we just take a quick look around? Put everyone's mind at ease." "No." The single word hung in the air like a declaration of war. Nash's false smile finally slipped, revealing the cold, predatory thing that lived underneath. "Now, friend, that's not very neighborly." "My land, my rules," Cassidy said, shifting his stance just slightly, bringing the rifle into a more ready position. "Unless you've got papers from a judge, you can ride on." Nash exchanged a long, silent look with his men. A whole conversation passed between them in that single glance. When he turned back to Cassidy, his hand was gripping his pistol openly. "Here's the thing about Apache girls," Nash said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "They're worth a lot of money to the right people, and men who interfere with business transactions, well, they tend to have accidents." Through the cabin's thin walls, Cassidy heard a new sound, the faint, careful scrape of wood on wood, a window being opened. Good girl. Aigana was smart. She was looking for an escape, but Nash heard it too, his head cocked to the side like a hunting dog catching a scent on the wind. "Sounds like you might have mice," Nash said, his eyes glinting. And with a motion so fast it was almost a blur, he drew his pistol. The standoff lasted for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the world exploded. Cassidy's rifle was already coming up as Nash's pistol cleared its holster. The sharp crack of gunfire was drowned out by the crash of breaking glass from the cabin's rear window. Cassidy didn't think. He reacted. He dove sideways, hitting the dirt behind his water trough just as bullets splintered the porch post where he'd been standing a second before. Through the chaos, he caught a flash of movement. Ayana, sprinting for the tree line. Her torn dress hampered her, but she moved with a desperate, wild grace. One of Nash's men spurred his horse, wheeling around to pursue her. Cassidy's next shot was instinctive. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the horse. The animal screamed and reared, dumping its rider hard onto the ground. "Bring her back alive," Nash bellowed, taking cover behind his own horse, using it as a living shield. "She's no good to us dead." The fallen rider scrambled to his feet, limping but determined, and took off after Ayana on foot. The third man was circling the cabin, trying to get a flanking angle. Cassidy was pinned down. His military instincts, the ones he'd tried to bury for 3 years, took over completely. He rolled left, came up firing, and drove the flanking rider back behind the cover of the woodshed. But Nash was already on the move, advancing on the porch, using his horse as mobile cover. The man was skilled. Cassidy had to give him that. Too skilled for a common bounty hunter. This was something else entirely. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Flynn," Nash called out. The name hit Cassidy like a physical blow. Flynn. He knew his name. How in God's name did he know his name? "We know about Fort Defiance," Nash shouted, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "We know what happened there." That hesitation, that single frozen moment of shock, almost cost him his life. A bullet punched through the water trough, showering his face with splinters and foul-smelling water. Fort Defiance. The name was a key, unlocking a room in his mind he'd nailed shut. The smell of smoke and blood, the screams of the dying, the terrible weight of a choice that had shattered his life and haunted every sunrise since. How did Nash know about that cursed place? From the woods, he heard the sound of breaking branches and a man's angry cursing. Ayanna was putting up a fight, but she was injured and exhausted. She couldn't run forever. He had to end this. Now. Cassidy feinted left, drawing fire from both Nash and the man by the woodshed. Then he rolled right, came up running. A low, desperate scramble. The flanking rider never saw him coming. The heavy stock of Cassidy's rifle connected with the man's temple with a sickening crunch. He dropped like a sack of grain. Now it was one-on-one. Nash, seeing his man go down, backed away toward his horse, his pistol still trained on Cassidy. "This isn't over, Flynn," he hissed. "That girl is worth more than you can possibly imagine. There are people who will pay a king's ransom for Chief Ironbear's daughter." Chief Ironbear. The name was like a thunderclap, and suddenly everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Ayanna wasn't just any Apache girl. She was royalty, the daughter of one of the most powerful and feared leaders in the entire territory. That didn't just make her valuable. It made her a political weapon, a hostage, a bargaining chip in a game Cassidy didn't even know was being played. Nash swung up onto his horse, never taking his eyes or his gun off Cassidy. "You can't protect her forever. We'll be back, and next time, we'll bring more men." As Nash spurred his horse and galloped toward the woods to regroup with his last conscious man, Cassidy felt a cold dread settle in his gut. He hadn't just helped an injured girl. He had stumbled into the middle of a high-stakes kidnapping plot targeting the very heart of the Apache leadership. A moment later, two horses crashed out of the woods, Nash and his man. But there was no sign of Ayanna. Had she escaped, or had they caught her? Without a second thought, Cassidy plunged into the trees, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from the run, but from a fear he hadn't felt since Fort Defiance. The ice-cold fear of being too late to save someone who mattered. He found her 20 yards in, crouched behind a fallen log. Blood was seeping through her dress where the head wound had reopened. But she was breathing hard, her eyes alert and blazing with defiance. In her hands, she gripped a heavy, thick branch like a war club. A few feet away, the unconscious form of Nash's man lay sprawled on the ground, a nasty, bleeding gash across his forehead. She had taken him down herself. "Did I kill him?" she asked. And this time she spoke in perfect, unaccented English. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the terror he'd seen in her eyes just minutes before. Cassidy knelt beside the groaning man and felt for a pulse. "No, but you gave him something to remember you by." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not a victim, but a fighter. "Chief Ironbear's daughter knows how to handle herself." Her eyes flashed, a mixture of surprise and anger. "How do you know my father?" "I don't," Cassidy said, helping her to her feet. He noticed her wince and favor her left ankle. Nash let it slip. "Are you hurt?" "I can walk," she said, testing her weight on the ankle. She couldn't. Not far and not fast. The distant sound of horses moving through the woods told them Nash was regrouping, coming back for his man and for her. Cassidy's mind raced. His cabin was no longer safe. They knew where he was, and they'd be back in force. "There's an old line shack," he said, making a split-second decision. "About 2 miles north of here. It's rough, but it's defensible. We can hold up there until dark and figure out our next move." As they moved as quickly as they could through the dense trees, Ayanna broke the silence. "Why did he mention Fort Defiance?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What happened there?" Cassidy's jaw tightened into a hard line. Nothing that matters now. It matters if it's the reason you're helping me, she insisted, stopping and forcing him to turn and face her. Men like Nash don't know about obscure military posts unless they have connections, unless they've done their research. What kind of soldier were you, Cassidy Flynn? The question hung between them, sharp as a blade. He looked at her face, at the intelligence and fierce determination in her eyes. She wasn't a girl. She was a woman caught in something terrible, and she deserved the truth, especially if that truth was going to get them both killed. The kind that made mistakes, he said finally, his voice rough with unshed guilt. 3 years ago, I was a lieutenant stationed at Fort Defiance. There was an incident. An Apache peace delegation came to talk. Things went wrong. People died who shouldn't have. Understanding and a new kind of horror dawned in her expression. You were there, she whispered. You were there when they murdered the peace chiefs. I was there when everything went to hell. Cassidy corrected her, starting to walk again, needing the movement to escape the weight of her stare. Your people came to negotiate a trade agreement. My commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, didn't want peace. He wanted a war. He saw profit in it. And you, what did you want? I wanted to follow my orders, he admitted, the words tasting like ash. But when the shooting started, I had to choose a side. He paused at the edge of a small clearing, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. I chose the side that got me court-martialed, drummed out of the army, and exiled to this forgotten ridge. Ayanna looked at him with new eyes. You tried to protect the delegation. I tried, he said, the words heavy with the ghosts of 3 years. It wasn't enough. 5 good men from your tribe died that day. They died because I hesitated for 10 seconds when I should have acted. They reached the line shack just as the sun began to bleed across the western peaks. It was a small, weathered structure, but the log walls were thick and it offered a clear view of the surrounding terrain. As they settled inside, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to them, Ayanna reached into a hidden pocket inside her torn dress. She pulled out a small oilskin pouch. This is why they want me, she said, her voice low and intense. She opened the pouch and carefully laid several folded pieces of paper on the rough wooden table. They were letters. Letters covered in neat, official-looking handwriting. Letters from Army officers. They were battle plans, detailed strategies for unprovoked attacks on Apache settlements. They were lists of names, men taking bribes to start a war. Cassidy felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled as he picked up one of the letters. He recognized the signature at the bottom. Colonel Morrison, his old commanding officer, the man who had orchestrated his dismissal. Another signature belonged to Captain Willis, the man who had led the attack on the peace delegation. And a third was from Major Hendricks, the man who had lied on the witness stand, swearing that Cassidy had fired the first shot. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was the key to a massive conspiracy. Where did you get these? Cassidy asked, his voice a hollow whisper. Ayanna's eyes filled with a grief so profound it was almost a physical thing. I stole them, she said, her voice hardening, from the men who killed my brother. The letters changed everything. This wasn't just about her, it was about her entire people. Your brother discovered this? He asked gently. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Running Wolf worked as a scout for the army. He trusted them. He thought he was helping to build peace. He found these documents in Captain Willis's quarters and brought them to me, his closest kin. Her voice grew brittle. 3 days later, they found his body by the river. The army said he fell from his horse in the dark and drowned. But you know better. Running Wolf could swim better than the fish in that river, she said with cold fury. And horses don't throw riders hard enough to crack their skulls from behind. She touched the silver necklace at her throat, the one that had haunted Cassidy's dreams. This was his. It was the only thing they left me, the only piece of him I have left. The necklace. Cassidy stared at it, and a horrifying, sickening piece of the puzzle slammed into place. I saw him die, he breathed, the words tearing from his throat. Ayanna went completely still, her face a mask of confusion and shock. What? 3 years ago, at Fort Defiance, Cassidy said, his voice cracking. There was a young Apache scout. He tried to warn the peace delegation about the ambush. He was wearing that necklace. I saw him. I tried to reach him, but the shooting had already started. He took 3 bullets protecting Chief Stone Crow. Ayana shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. That, that wasn't Running Wolf, she whispered. That was our cousin, Brave Eagle. Running Wolf died 6 months ago. The truth hit Cassidy with the force of a physical blow. The conspiracy hadn't started a few months ago. It had been running for years. They were systematically eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. First Brave Eagle, who tried to stop the massacre at Fort Defiance, then Running Wolf when he found the physical proof. And now Ayana, who held that proof in her hands. They're going to start a war, Cassidy said, his eyes scanning the documents again. According to this, they've been planning a series of unprovoked attacks on Apache settlements. They'll make them look like savage raids. Then they'll go to Washington, demanding military contracts to supply a full-scale campaign of retaliation. It's all about blood money. Ayana's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. They will kill hundreds of my people. For profit. Suddenly a new sound cut through the evening air. The sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. Cassidy scrambled to the window, his heart sinking. He counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, picking their way carefully up the mountain trail in the fading light. Nash was at the front, and the men with him were not trappers or bounty hunters. They were hard-looking men, carrying repeating rifles, with the cold, disciplined bearing of professional killers. Nash had kept his word. He had brought more men. "We need to move, now," Cassidy said, grabbing the letters and stuffing them back into the pouch. "Is there somewhere safe you can take these? Someone who will believe you?" "Agent Thompson," she said immediately, "at the territorial office in Santa Fe. He knew my brother. He trusted him. He would listen." She struggled to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "But Santa Fe is a 3-day ride, and I can barely walk." The riders were close now, close enough that Cassidy could see the grim, determined set of their faces. "I have a horse," Cassidy said, his mind racing. "A good one. Hidden in the canyon below this shack. We can make a run for it." A sharp crack echoed across the clearing, and the window just above Cassidy's head exploded in a shower of glass and splintered wood. A voice, amplified by the twilight quiet, boomed from the tree line. "Cassidy Flynn, send out the girl, and we'll let you walk away from this." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Ayana touched his arm, her eyes pleading. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Give me the letters. Let me go. They want me, not you." Cassidy looked at her, at this brave, terrified young woman who had lost her brother and her cousin, who carried the fate of her people in a small leather pouch. He saw the same impossible choice he'd faced 3 years ago at Fort Defiance. The choice between safety and duty, between running and fighting, between hesitation and action. "No," he said, his voice hard as iron as he checked the load in his rifle. "This time, I don't hesitate." The world erupted in a storm of lead and fire. The line shack shuddered as dozens of bullets ripped through the log walls, sending splinters flying through the air like deadly insects. Cassidy shoved Ayana down behind the heavy oak table he'd dragged into the center of the room, then returned fire through the broken window. It was 6, maybe 7, against one fit man and an injured woman. The odds were impossible, but the thick log walls of the shack offered them a fighting chance. "There's a root cellar," Cassidy shouted over the deafening roar of the gunfire. "Behind the old stove in the corner. Can you make it?" Ayana nodded, clutching the precious leather pouch against her chest. She began to crawl, staying low, moving toward the back of the shack while Cassidy laid down a steady, precise stream of covering fire. His military training was all that was keeping them alive. Pick a target, conserve ammunition, make every single shot count. He dropped one of the men who got too bold, sending him tumbling from his horse. Another screamed and clutched a shattered arm. But Nash was no fool. He wasn't leading a frontal assault. While his men kept Cassidy pinned down from the front and sides, the leader himself was circling around, silent as a shadow, to the rear of the building. Cassidy caught a flicker of movement through a crack in the back wall just a second before the rear door burst open with a splintering crash. "Drop the rifle, Flynn." Cassidy spun around. Nash stood in the doorway, his pistol leveled, not at Cassidy, but at Ayanna. She was halfway to the cellar entrance, frozen in place like a startled deer. "One wrong move," Nash snarled, "and she's dead before she hits the floor." "Smart choice," Nash said, with a triumphant smirk as Cassidy slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle. "Now kick it over here." Cassidy complied, sliding the weapon across the rough floorboards. His mind was racing, calculating, searching for an opening. Any opening at all. The shooting outside had stopped. That meant Nash's men were now surrounding the building, waiting. Even if he could somehow overpower Nash, they would never make it out of the shack alive. They were trapped. "Where are the letters?" Nash demanded, his eyes burning with greed. "What letters?" Ayanna said, her voice shaking but defiant. Nash moved with shocking speed, backhanding her across the face so hard she stumbled and fell. "Don't play games with me, girl. Your brother was a thief. He stole documents that belonged to very important, very powerful men. We want them back." Cassidy started forward, a roar of fury building in his chest, but Nash's pistol swung instantly toward him. "Easy, hero. You've caused enough trouble for one day." "The letters are hidden," Ayanna lied, blood trickling from her split lip. "Where you'll never find them, even if you kill us both." "Oh, we're not going to kill you," Nash said with that same cold, reptilian smile. "You're far too valuable alive. But your friend here," he shrugged, a gesture of casual cruelty, "he's expendable." The pistol swung back toward Cassidy. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch into an eternity. In that single crystalline moment, Cassidy saw his entire life, the shame of his court-martial, the lonely years on the ridge, the faces of the men who died at Fort Defiance because he had waited too long. He saw it all compressed into one final, terrible choice. He could surrender, hope they'd honor some bargain, maybe find another chance to escape later. Or he could act, right now, knowing it would probably cost him everything, but it might, just might, buy Ayanna the few seconds she needed to get to safety. 3 years ago, he had hesitated, and good men had died. Not this time. Just as Nash's finger tightened on the trigger, Cassidy lunged. The bullet that was meant for his heart caught him high in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around but not stopping his desperate forward momentum. He crashed into Nash, his weight carrying them both to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. The cabin filled with the deafening roar of the gunshot. Nash was strong, a coiled bundle of muscle and rage, but Cassidy had 3 years of guilt and a desperate need for redemption fueling him. They rolled across the rough planks, grappling for control of the pistol. Cassidy managed to slam Nash's gun hand against the floor, but Nash drove a knee up into Cassidy's wounded shoulder, sending a wave of white-hot agony through his entire body. His vision started to blur at the edges. Through the haze of pain, he heard the sound he had been praying for, the loud, unmistakable creak of the cellar door being thrown open, followed by the scrape of it being shut. Ayanna was safe. Nash heard it too. With a snarl of pure fury, he twisted under Cassidy, using a surge of adrenaline to break free. He brought the pistol around, aiming it at the cellar door, ready to blast the lock apart. "No!" Cassidy roared, and with the last of his strength, he threw himself across Nash's body, shielding the cellar door. The second shot was deafening in the small space. The bullet tore into Cassidy's chest, and the world dissolved into a wash of gray. He couldn't feel the pain anymore, just a strange, spreading cold. But he held on. He used his fading consciousness, his dying weight, to keep Nash pinned down. And then he heard it, a new sound, the thundering of distant hoofbeats. Help was coming. Or maybe, he thought as the darkness closed in, it was just the rest of Nash's men, finally coming to finish the job. The hoofbeats were not Nash's men. They belonged to Apache warriors. The door to the shack was kicked in, not by a mercenary, but by a man whose face was a mask of grim authority. He was older, his features weathered like the mountains themselves, carved from stone and fury. It was Chief Iron Bear. He led a war party of at least a dozen men, their faces painted for battle, their eyes filled with a cold, righteous anger. Nash scrambled backward, his pistol forgotten on the floor, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He understood in that single heart-stopping moment how drastically and completely the tables had turned. "Father!" Ayana emerged from the cellar, clutching the precious leather pouch. She was disheveled, her face bruised and bloodied, but she was alive, and her eyes blazed with defiance. A flicker of profound relief crossed the chief's stoic features. "You are hurt, daughter." "I will live," she said, her voice ringing with strength. She rushed to Cassidy's side, kneeling in the spreading pool of his blood, trying to staunch the bleeding from his chest with a piece of her torn dress. "But this man," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "he saved my life. Without him, Nash would have killed me and destroyed the evidence." Chief Ironbear's dark, piercing eyes settled on Nash, who was now backed into a corner, trembling like a trapped animal. "You are the one," the chief said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "who took my daughter." "Now hold on," Nash stammered, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked fear. "This is all a misunderstanding, a business transaction. We were hired to retrieve stolen property." "Silence!" The chief's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through Nash's pathetic excuses. "My scouts have been tracking you for 2 days. We followed the trail of your violence. We know what you are." Outside the shack, Cassidy could hear the sounds of a swift, brutal disarming. He heard the clatter of weapons hitting the ground, followed by the nervous, pleading voices of Nash's men begging for their lives. The reinforcements Nash had counted on were now his greatest liability. "The letters, father," Ayana said, holding up the oilskin pouch. "Running Wolf died to get these. Brave Eagle died because of them. They prove it. The army is planning to massacre our people for profit." Chief Iron Bear took the documents from his daughter, his expression growing darker and colder with each page he read. "Colonel Morrison," he said, the name a curse on his lips. "I know this name. He came to my people last winter. He offered to sell us rifles. He said he wanted to help us defend ourselves from our enemies." The terrible, cynical irony of it hung heavy in the air. He planned to arm us, then use our own weapons as proof of our aggression, a justification for our slaughter. Cassidy struggled to sit up, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. The world was beginning to fade. "Agent Thompson," he forced the words out, his voice a ragged whisper. "In Santa Fe. He'll listen. He can stop this." "You know Agent Thompson?" the chief asked, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at the wounded man. "Served with his brother," Cassidy gasped. "Fort Defiance. Good man. He'll want to see those letters." He coughed, a spray of blood speckling his lips. "Nash. He works for the conspiracy. He knows the names, the contacts. Make him talk." Nash's face had gone from pale to a ghostly ashen. "You can't," he pleaded, looking at the chief. "You can't let them take me. I'm a white man. There are laws." "The same laws that were going to let you start a war?" Ayana's voice was ice. "The same laws that said it was acceptable to murder my brother and cover it up?" Chief Iron Bear studied Cassidy for a long moment, his eyes holding the measured assessment of a man who had spent a lifetime judging the hearts of others. "Why?" the chief asked simply. "Why did you help my daughter? You could have turned her over to these men. You could have saved yourself." Cassidy met the chief's gaze, finding a last reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. "3 years ago," he said, each word a struggle, "I failed to protect your people when it mattered most. Good men died because I hesitated." He looked at Ayana, at the impossible strength and courage that ran in her family's blood. "I wasn't going to fail again." A silent understanding passed between the two men. One, a disgraced soldier desperate for redemption. The other, a proud chief and a father who had come within a breath of losing his daughter to greed and conspiracy. "My daughter says you took bullets that were meant for her," the chief said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same," Cassidy whispered. "No," Chief Ironbear said, his voice firm. "They would not. Most men think only of saving themselves." He turned to his warriors. "Bind this one," he ordered, pointing a finger at Nash, "and the others outside. We take them to Santa Fe. We will deliver them to Agent Thompson. Let the white man's courts decide their fate after they hear their testimony." Nash's face crumpled in utter defeat. He knew with absolute certainty what kind of testimony the Apache warriors would extract from him on the long ride to Santa Fe. 6 weeks later, Cassidy Flynn sat on the porch of his rebuilt cabin. The morning sun was painting the distant mountains in shades of golden rose. His chest still ached with a dull fire where Nash's bullets had torn through him, but the ache was a reminder that he was alive. The Apache medicine woman, a wise old woman with hands as gentle as her eyes were sharp, had worked miracles with herbal poultices and patient care. The scars, she'd told him, would remain. A reminder. He was alive. He had a reminder. That was more than he'd had in a long, long time. The conspiracy had unraveled with astonishing speed. Once Agent Thompson had the letters, corroborated by a very talkative Gideon Nash, the dominoes began to fall. Colonel Morrison was in a military prison, awaiting court-martial. Captain Willis had tried to flee west, but territorial marshals had run him to ground in California. Nash's testimony had implicated a dozen more officers and government contractors, all of them now facing justice. The war they had so carefully planned, the war that was supposed to make them rich, would never happen. A sound from the path below drew his attention. Ayanna was approaching on horseback, riding with the fluid, effortless grace of someone who was born in the saddle. She'd been coming by every few days, at first to bring food and check on his recovery, as her father had commanded. But lately her visits seemed less about duty and more about something else, something quieter that passed between them in the comfortable silences. "You're looking stronger," she said, dismounting and tying her horse to the porch rail. "Feels stronger," he admitted. "Your father's medicine woman works miracles." "She says you heal quickly for a stubborn white man," Ayanna said, and the corner of her mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. Her words, not mine. They sat for a while without speaking, watching the day brighten over the valley. It was a peaceful silence, one that Cassidy was beginning to crave. Finally, Ayanna spoke, her voice soft. "Agent Thompson sent a rider. He wants to offer you a position, a territorial scout. He says men who understand both sides of the conflict are rare, and men who are willing to bleed for what's right are even rarer." Cassidy considered this. 3 years ago, he had come to this ridge to escape the world and all its messy, painful complications. But the isolation hadn't brought him peace. It had only hollowed him out. Only the chaos of helping Ayanna, of finally choosing a side and sticking to it, had begun to fill that emptiness inside him. He looked at her strong, honest face. "What do you think I should do?" Ayanna looked out at the mountains, her gaze distant. "I think," she said carefully, "that good men shouldn't hide from their purpose. My father says you have the heart of a warrior, even if you doubt yourself." "And what does his daughter say?" Cassidy asked, his voice quiet. She was silent for a long moment, her fingers toying with the silver necklace that had started it all. The necklace of a hero, the necklace of her brother. "His daughter says," she began, turning to look him directly in the eye, "that some accidents change everything for the better." Cassidy looked at her, at this remarkable woman who had fought kidnappers, exposed a vast conspiracy, and somehow, through it all, had found the strength to forgive the world that had taken so much from her. The accident of finding her bleeding by his creek had not been the biggest mistake of his life. It had been his only chance at redemption. "I never did kidnap you, technically," he said, a dry smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "No," she agreed, her own smile finally breaking through. "But you did save me," which turned out to be the same thing in the end. She stood to leave, pausing as she swung up onto her horse. "Agent Thompson is expecting an answer by next week." A new light danced in her eyes. "If you do take the job, you'll probably see a lot more of the territorial office in Santa Fe. I'm working with Agent Thompson now, helping to establish better communication between the Apache tribes and the territorial government." She gathered the reins, her expression a mix of challenge and invitation. Someone needs to make sure that incidents like Fort Defiance never, ever happen again. As she rode away, her back straight and proud against the morning sun, Cassidy knew his choice was already made. The broken man who had hidden on this ridge for 3 years was gone. He had been replaced by someone who had finally learned the difference between running from the past and atoning for it. He had a letter to write, a job to accept. The accident of helping Ayana had given him back more than his honor. It had given him a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, it had given him a future he had long ago stopped believing was possible. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption from the forgotten corners of history. And if you really want to support the channel, consider clicking that join button or sending a super chat. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep these stories alive.